Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History, U.S. Government Edition. So sometimes you'll hear a lot of your fellow Americans saying, hey, it's a free country. And usually that phrase falls right out of their mouth hole when they've been criticized for doing something either dumb or offensive. You know, I don't think that group of people would appreciate being called such words. It's a free country. You know, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to swim naked in the Mississippi River. Free country? Well, yeah, but free country! Now, it is altogether true that America is indeed a free country, but that does not mean we can do and say whatever we want to do and say. In fact, there are limits to our freedoms, and we fight about those limits all the time. For example, should someone's religious convictions give them the right to deny a marriage license to a gay couple? Should a person be able to say whatever they want about another group, even if it's deeply hurtful? All of these questions are raised and answered in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is also known as the Bill of Rights. And it's within those 10 amendments that we find what civil liberties are guaranteed to us Americans. And so in this video, we're going to find out exactly what freedoms we are granted by the Bill of Rights and how far those freedoms go. Okay, let's start with some definitions. The freedoms we are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are called civil liberties. And don't confuse those with civil rights, because that's a different thing altogether. Civil liberties are the freedoms that we enjoy, whereas civil rights has to do with our equality to enjoy those freedoms. And the first thing you need to know about these civil liberties is that they are not absolute. Whenever the Supreme Court takes up cases involving these freedoms, they are always trying to do a balancing act between two extremes. And one of the main trade-offs they make is between civil liberties and national security. So for example, under the Bush administration, we got ourselves into what was called the War on Terror. And since, as Americans, we all treasure the protection that we have against cruel and unusual punishment, the way the Bush administration got around that was to transport prisoners to countries like Jordan and Egypt and torture them there instead of within our own borders. And that's the balancing act. Do we deny someone their basic civil liberties if we believe our nation is in danger? And before you answer too quickly, think about this scenario. Suppose a man plants a nuclear bomb in the middle of a large metropolitan area and then tweets later about how it's going to blow up in 3 hours. Do you think we ought to waive his right to avoiding cruel and unusual punishment so that he will indeed tell us where that bomb is? I mean, I don't know. That's why it's so difficult to understand where these things should begin and end. So when it comes to civil liberties, there's always a trade-off between freedom and national security. But the court often engages in another trade-off as well, the one between civil liberties and public safety. For example, there's a certain strain of fundamentalist Christians who believe that it is their religious duty to handle poisonous snakes in their worship services. They believe, based on an obscure passage from the Gospel of Mark chapter 16, that the ability to handle snakes and not be harmed by them proves the reality of their faith. And you might think anything you want to about them, but they really believe it to be true. So should their religious convictions overrule the public safety concern of bringing out deadly snakes into a public gathering? Well, in this case, the court has pretty consistently said no. Public safety is more important than your religious conviction. But not only do the courts have to balance our liberties with competing interests, the court is also concerned with drawing boundary lines on those freedoms. And some people might argue that there should be no boundary lines on our freedoms. Free country. But if that's the case, you're just not thinking about it hard enough. I mean, should a person have a right to walk into a crowded theater and yell fire? I mean, suppose everybody believes him and they all try to run out and panic, and in the process a child gets trampled and killed. I mean, should that be protected speech? And in general, the courts have said no, that is not protected speech. So it's always a balancing act with civil liberties. And that's a very good thing, because sometimes me living out my freedoms will impinge on you being able to live out your freedoms. And so to make sure that we all have as much freedom and liberty as possible, we draw boundary lines on them and we try to balance them according to competing interests. Alright, now let's do a little history. Where did these rights even come from? First of all, remember that the Bill of Rights comes to us as a set of amendments to the Constitution, which means they weren't actually in the Constitution to begin with. In fact, in the Constitution itself, as it was ratified, there are only 3 protections for civil liberties. The first is habeas corpus rights, which means we have the protection against illegal incarceration. The second is the prohibition against bills of attainder, which means that we are protected against being punished for a crime without first having a trial. And then the third is the prohibition against ex post facto laws, which means declaring something a crime after it was committed. And those are the only civil liberties protected in the original Constitution. It was our old friends the Anti-Federalists who said that such a meager protection of civil liberties was not enough. In fact, they said that their states would not ratify the Constitution until there was a proper Bill of Rights attached to it. And frankly, I think most Americans today will agree with them. But the Federalists did have a good argument for not including a Bill of Rights. And they argued like this, like, suppose we do list out all the civil liberties our people possess. It's not really possible to list all of them. I mean, we're surely going to forget some or not consider some. And if we actually list them out, people could be lulled into the false sense that these are the only rights they possess. And I would suggest this is actually a good argument on the part of the Federalists. I mean, think about all the arguments that we're having in our country today. You know, back a couple of years ago when President Obama was pushing all of his healthcare initiatives, like, people were arguing that healthcare is a right, but it's not in the Bill of Rights. So is it really? And we hear people talk today about how marriage is a fundamental right. But again, it's not in the Bill of Rights. So is it really? I mean, can I say that anything is a right just as long as I believe it hard enough? You can see that we're actually living out the exact fear that the Federalists had in writing down our civil liberties. But even so, the Federalists conceded to the Anti-Federalists and eventually added the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, to the Constitution. But there's something very interesting to consider here, that the Bill of Rights does have limits. You see, the civil liberties contained in the Bill of Rights only apply to the federal government and not to the states. Like, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, etc., etc. Like, this is a federal protection. And the truth is, the Bill of Rights that we know and love and cherish today actually played a very small role in the lives of Americans during the first 100 years of our nation. And that's because during that time, the main relationship that an American citizen had to government was to their state government. But then something momentous happened. We went ahead and got ourselves into a civil war, and part of what happened with that war is that a whole population of slaves were freed and made citizens of the United States. But since our main relationship with the government heretofore was with our state governments, the federal Congress thought it was pretty likely that my southern brethren would not make it easy for them to enjoy their new liberty. So Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which says the following: no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, I don't know if you caught it, but this amendment sounds very similar to the 5th Amendment, which says this: no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So it's the same language, but there's one massive difference. The 5th Amendment was ratified with the original Constitution back in 1788, and it only protected our civil liberties with respect to the federal government. And the 14th Amendment says that no state shall violate these liberties, because they obviously thought that the southern states would be at least tempted to violate the civil liberties of former slaves. So the 14th Amendment is super important because it takes the civil liberties that we are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights and applies them to the states. And since the 14th Amendment was ratified, the Supreme Court is engaged in a process of what's called selective incorporation. And all that means is that they've just heard lots of cases over the years based on our civil liberties in the first 10 amendments, and they've used the 14th Amendment to apply those liberties to the states. And that's what you need to know about the Bill of Rights. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Alright, thanks for watching another episode of Heimler's History. And I'd be interested to know if you think that we possess any liberties that are not actually written down in the Bill of Rights. And if so, let me know down below in the comments. If this video is helpful, hit the like button and let me know. And finally, if you want to expand your civil liberties by learning more about them, then hit the subscribe button and come along.